So, if you're one of those who follow me, you might be a little confused right now. And to that I say, hear me out. And if you're not, welcome. My name is Velynda and I'm a story lore enthusiast. I normally do clip compilations or character analysis, but this time I decided to do something a little different. See, I'm someone who loves getting into different medias, and a few days ago I got up to date with the manga by the name of Kagurabachi. And frankly, I love it. And while normally I just go yap about it to my friends, this time I decided instead of going to them, I'm just gonna sit here and make a whole video about it instead. This isn't gonna be as structured as my usual videos, more so just me professing my newly found affection towards this manga. Talking about the various details of it and why I think this manga is so GOATED. Sharing it with everyone. And maybe, just maybe, even convince you to read it too. Join us. Become a Bachi bro. Okay, but seriously, if you have been on the anime manga side of Twitter, you may have heard of this manga before, or at least recognize this picture right here. And it all began about a year ago. At the time, I actually hadn't been following the anime manga side for a long time, but my For You page thought otherwise, cause I couldn't escape this picture. I didn't really know the context of what caused this, but suddenly this manga that didn't even have a single chapter out at the time was getting memed through hell and back by people generating fake hype for the series. Everyone was talking about it in a sarcastic, ironic kind of way. I thought it was pretty funny and liked a couple tweets, cause it was all just really entertaining to see go down, you know? And then it all disappeared from my For You page, and I never saw it again, until flash forward almost a year later, I start seeing the name pop up again. There were countless threads of people asking what they will be checking out now that My Hero Academia and Jujutsu Kaisen were nearing their ends. And right in the comments or in the repost, there were people recommending Kagurabachi. Now me, I've never read or watched Jujutsu Kaisen, and probably never will, but most of my mutuals did, which was why this discussion took over my page. In the midst of all this, there was this one person who was always there. And they were the ones who sparked my interest in reading this. And that person was Kagurabachi Brazil. If you're in the Kagurabachi fandom, you know who this is. They were like freaking Batman. At the mere mention of the word Kagurabachi, this man would fly into your comments faster than anyone ever could, and spreading nothing but positivity in the community. And that's what truly made me want to read this. The fandom was so genuinely passionate about this manga that I really wanted to see why so many liked it so much. I am a very passion-driven person, so it was really inevitable. So after giving Kagurabachi Brazil a follow, I went on ahead and went into the story blind, and ended up getting heavily invested. I knew I was in for a ride. Now, I don't watch much shonen. It's been a long time since I watched or read one, so I can only speak from my experience, aka from the things I've read and am knowledgeable about up till now. So upon starting it, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had some speculations here and there, but I didn't really want to go in with any expectations. So instead, I set them aside and allowed the story to speak for itself. The story begins with the main character, Chihiro Rokuhira, and his dad, Kunishige Rokuhira. The story is quick to establish a few things. Chihiro's dad is a famous swordsmith and makes special katanas, while his son, our protagonist, trains with him. And here's where I start naming some of the things I liked about this right out the jump. It's the way they showed off the dynamic of Chihiro and his dad and established what their personalities are like. Because some stories upon opening may focus more on showing off a badass fight or start lore dumping on you, but this story keeps it very brief and focuses more on connecting us with the personality and interactions of the two present. This is such an important aspect to me because the plot revolves around the characters, and I want to get to know them. I want to start liking them out the gate. So I'm glad they wasted no time in giving us that chance to connect with them. You'll immediately realize that the dad is brimming with personality, in contrast to Chihiro, who... We'll get back to him later, because trying to explain Chihiro right now is a bit of a handful, so instead, put a pin in that. All you need to know right now is that their dynamic is very silly in nature. While his dad is focused and serious when working, when he's not, he's just kinda goofy. In the middle of one of their practices, someone else is introduced, Shiba, whom they establish is a friend of Kunishige, and he too is pretty full of character. He sits and has a chat with Chihiro in which we learn more about Chihiro's dad. About 15 years ago, during a war, he was famous for the swords he made. Even more famous than the people, like Shiba himself, that fought in the battlefield. And, quote, it's no exaggeration to say the epic swords he made ended the war, and that Kunishige was a hero. Chihiro had heard all this before, but he didn't really seem to mind it. But during the whole conversation, Chihiro's dad seemed to have something on his mind. Since Chihiro was soon to be 15, he figured it was time to show him more aspects about being a swordsmith, specifically the more negative aspects the job entails. And here's where we get to see the more important themes that the story explores throughout, and that is the nuanced discussion of the nature of swordsmanship and where the swordsmith stands in that discussion. Swords are weapons. People create them to protect and save lives while simultaneously taking lives as well. Those who carry it should be people who want to vanquish evil, who want to protect. But a sword can be wielded by anyone, and it's easy for them to fall in the wrong hands and can be used for the opposite purpose of its creation, aka it can kill the innocent and the weak. The swordsmith must carry the weight of this possibility, the fact that someone could use the weapons they create to go on and cause detriment. When Chihiro hands over a katana to someone one day, he will have these principles and accountability in mind for whatever may happen after. Kunishige, in his own words, explains all this to Chihiro and asks if he can carry that burden. And while Chihiro isn't really sure, he was still willing to commit to taking it on. This discussion made the whole story more interesting to me. The ethics of combat tend to be explored often from the person who fights' perspective. But I'll be honest, I hardly ever think about the ethics or the burden people who make these weapons can have. This perspective tends to be more rare in my experience. And it opened a lot of possible discussions the story can explore with this theme. Like, for example, is it worth it to create a weapon so ruthless, even if it's for good? Should these even exist to begin with? My mind began to wander. With the protagonist being someone who is familiar with this burden, how will it impact his acts throughout? Well, there's only one way to find out, right? We have to keep reading. Midway through chapter 1, we get a flash forward to 38 months later. Which, can I just say, Can't they just say it's been 3 years and 2 months? Why do y'all gotta make me do the math somehow? Anyway, the panel immediately shows someone slicing someone else with a sword, which is very interesting considering the discussion that was just introduced to us like a panel or two earlier. It doesn't take long for us to know that the people causing the violence is a group of Yakuzas, who also have a sorcerer with them, who after putting this poor guy in his place, just leaves. As it then switches over to Chihiro, who we can estimate is now 18 and looks a little different than when we first saw him. He now has a scar on the side of his face and slightly messier hair. The story is quick to point out the scar, having Shiba ask about it and telling Chihiro that the scar could be removed. But Chihiro doesn't directly respond to him, rather we get this iconic quote from him. "Every morning, when I wash my face and look into the mirror, I see the scar, and I remember that day. So every day, I start the morning with fresh hatred." We will come back to this line once we get to talking about the character of Chihiro, because the fandom loves goofing this line. Not for any negative reasons or anything, but we'll get there when we get there, okay? Just hang with me here. Either way, after saying this, Shiba tells him that this path will break him, to which Chihiro dismisses. Apparently, the two are there to find the Yakuza, believing it may have a connection to them. We don't know who this them refers to yet, and we don't have much time to think about who they could be, because right when the two get off the train, they are met with people hanging off this, the hell is this called? A bridge? A bridge road? Hanging off the bridge road are the people we saw getting slashed earlier. From the talks of the people who are around us, we learned that they were leading the anti-Kurogumi movement, fighting for the citizens. The city is ruled by the Kurogumi Yakuza, which were the same Yakuza folk who we saw before. Initially, Chihiro wanted to see if these Yakuza folk were reasonable to propose a deal with them, but upon seeing the scene, he takes it back, instead telling Shiba if he knew where their base was. The scene switches up, showing us what seems to be the Yakuza base with a few members talking around the table. A conversation that gets cut short because of Shiba and Chihiro's arrival, killing the ones at the table and making his way into the other room, with probably some of the coldest panel art ever. The guys try to call for the guards, but Shiba already took care of them, and then he starts talking to the guys he defeated about Chihiro, claiming that they've heard of him, right? And he basically monologues as Chihiro confronts the Yakuza with more cold art shots. Just look at this. The swordsmith principles also once again come into play. Hence, when asked what he wanted, he claimed to want to ask something, and that on top of that, I quote, "cannot allow slime like you to wield a katana." In this scene, we get to see a hint of what the power system is like, with us watching Chihiro fight as Shiba pretty much narrates over it. Up to this point, we knew his father was famous for his swords, but now we get to know what exactly made his sword so special and famous, and that was the fact that he imbued his katanas with sorcery. They were enchanted with special powers, and we get to see them in action. The katana Chihiro uses is the last katana Kunishige gave his life to make, and it would release what seems to be a water ability, summoning these fish. I haven't mentioned it actually, but during the beginning scenes when they are showing us the characters and showing off their interactions, there's a scene where we get to see Kunishige talk to these fish. Yeah, he's just silly like that, you know? Chihiro talks about these 3 fish that his dad scored on the way back from work one day. The shop guy claimed that the goldfish were good luck. Red was for good fortune, black was to ward off evil, and the color one was supposed to be super amazing. I don't know, their words, not mine. But it made me kinda curious, so I decided to search a bit on goldfish, but ended up finding more on the koi fish instead. Though goldfish and koi fish are, in the sense, family, they are exactly the same thing, but regardless, I found some pretty interesting details. Koi fish tend to represent and symbolize in Japanese culture courage, resilience, and perseverance. And it is believed that they share the same bravery as the samurai due to their ability to overcome. For a story like this, having the fish be a part of the katana Chihiro uses suits it very well. As for the more common goldfish, the general meaning in most places is prosperity and abundance. There's also these weird, conspicuous details I also found, like how it's best to keep uneven numbers of fish, mainly 1 or 3, and have at least one black fish, which is said to absorb negative energy, kinda like what the shop owner said to Kunishige. So the meanings were pretty much correct, but I was more so curious on what the actual meaning of the colored fish was, though I was disappointed to find that its meaning is uncertain. If you happen to know, do tell. I spent too much time researching on these little guys. The over-analysis started taking over me for a moment there. But I digress, cause when I saw how they implemented the fish, something that I thought would never be relevant at all, into the story, by making it a summon part of the katana's power, made my interest be even more piqued. How did the fish end up becoming a part of the weapon like this? It made me appreciate the details of the story way more too, because it seemed like it was all shown off the way it was for a reason. So Chihiro begins to slice these guys with some more really cool panel art until they are all down with only one Yakuza member left alive, the leader. And here is where we learn as to why Chihiro wanted to find these Yakuza folk. He wanted to know more about a sorcerer group called the Hishaku. He is warned that those guys are monsters, but Chihiro dismisses this and tells the man he has to cut them down. And then the first chapter ends, leaving us on a cliffhanger. With so many questions, I don't know how the people who read this on release could do it, man. Cause when I read this, I went to that second chapter so fast. I'm so glad I read this when we had plenty of chapters out, and by that I mean 46, but you know what, close enough, we take those. Now, this is an incredible first chapter. It wasn't overwhelming to read, rather it explained briefly the things that were necessary to know in the moment, rather than just lore dump you everything about the world and expect you to remember it all later. But it also wasn't boring or underwhelming. It was the perfect setup, giving us a good taste on what it's all about. A solid start that makes you want to read more and see how it continues to expand. So now that I've loosely explained the whole first chapter, or the intro of the series, so to speak, now I want to talk more so on the overall things I enjoyed that pretty much enhanced my experience and that made it such a good read. I mentioned it briefly before, but I love the expressions. I'm not sure how to describe it, but there's just something so, I don't know, just something so charming about it. And there we go, that's the word. And to be honest, that's the word I think I would use to describe the series as a whole. There's something just really charming in the way the characters express themselves that, though characteristic, still feels natural in a way. I'm not fully sure how to elaborate on it, like it doesn't feel like tonal whiplash when we get to these moments. The story knows how to balance silly with seriousness, something that not many can achieve well. Some ways that they sprinkle in these silly factors gotta be by the dialogue and the way they present it. One of my favorite examples of this presentation is this panel right here. So, some of these characters, they have a bit of a poker face. Like, you wouldn't be able to know what they are thinking if it wasn't for the fact that we can see their thought bubbles right next to them. So we end up getting moments like this one. And it just gets me because it feels very real. Like seeing such a stern, serious face, having this kind of dialogue going through his head. Like someone you know definitely has this kind of character. It's also extremely ironic given the context too, because he's over here thinking about, oh, this is a huge gamble and Chihiro has such a poker face given the stakes. I'm shocked, it gives me chills. As if his goofy ass ain't doing the same thing right now. The expression lines here just enhance the unserious tone it has. It's intentionally made to be noticed, so you can pick up on the irony it's proposing. It'd be funnier than it should be, is all I'm saying. Another clever and silly moment featuring the dialogue presentation is this interaction where Chihiro asks this little girl if she would like to eat something, in which she would immediately say what she wanted, and then right after says, "Oh, you mean it?" And when I tell you, I thought I was tweaking or something. I had to read it like 3 times because I thought I missed something or that it was a mistake. But then right after, Chihiro says, but you already said what you wanted. If I had just read the next dialogue, but my dumbass, bro, it's such a short and silly interaction, but it just adds so much to the experience to me, and it makes it very memorable. But it's not just the silly moments though. The expressions for more serious or sad scenes are conveyed just as well, and make for more memorable moments. This panel here never fails to make me emotional. This just looks so amazing. Now, a story with good presentation of its tone enhances the experience, but it can't be good if its story pacing sucks balls. Because I believe a story needs 3 things: good interactions, good presentation, and good characters. They all tie in to form a good story, because just a good plot can't make a story. In the realm of good presentation lies good pacing. And luckily for us, this isn't a story that suffers from ass pacing. And let me explain. It definitely does not have your typical pacing, and there are a couple factors to this. Every story has a story structure, and there are different types of story structures. There are simple story structures like the plot pyramid, or common story structures like the hero's journey. We don't tend to pay attention to the structures the story may be using. Instead, we tend to compare the structure of one story to another to determine if it's a typical story format or not. Like, for example, the most common plot structure in shonen is the structure of the hero's journey. If you read a lot of shonen, you will definitely notice that a lot of them have the same similar patterns or approach to its presentation. However, I cannot say the same for Kagurabachi. Either it's missing steps or reversing the order, or perhaps a combination of different structures. Or maybe it's all 3. You cannot cave Kagurabachi into any of these formats because it feels more like they are combining and twisting these typical structures into something more unique. Each arc can take a different approach on how it presents itself. Sometimes it feels like it uses the 7-point structure. Other times it feels more like you're using the save the cat sheet. I even see loose connections with the insert word curve. But let's be real, ain't nobody wanna listen to me talk about the nitty gritty of it all. But what I mean to say is that the presentation is not like your typical shonen. And Hokazono wanted to find a structure and direction that had never been seen before. And yeah, I'd say so far they've done incredibly well in that. Even though it isn't your typical, it's still engaging and good to follow. The way each arc connects to each other so smoothly, there's literally no filler. Every chapter matters. If you skip one, you'll end up extremely confused because every chapter feels like it builds up to the next and builds up to the overall goal of the story. It's all actually relevant. There's also just a lot of attention to detail. I can't go too into depth because some of these are pretty spoilery. There's also moments where stuff can be happening in the background too, like other people talking or just cool panels like this. There are more that are kind of crazy, but I won't give it away. When you read it, you'll see what I'm talking about, alright? Yeah, this video is just Kagurabachi propaganda. Yeah, as it should be. I'm just kidding. But on the topic of details, we cannot go without talking about the characters. Because, like I said, a story needs 3 things to be a good story. And if y'all know me, I like myself some good characters. Of course I do. I do character analysis for crying out loud. Which is why I had to leave this segment for last. The first characters I want to talk about are the villains. Because everyone in the fandom gotta agree, the villains low-key go hard. Like some say they didn't need to do all that, but me, I'm glad they did. From cool powers to cool designs to even good duality, they all felt pretty compelling. Even father villains feel actually impactful. Like, I think we have normalized that the villains of the start tend to not be so great, but like, just because it's an introductory villain doesn't mean they shouldn't be memorable. The crucial or fleshed out villains or plot points shouldn't be just left for endgame. This isn't a slow burn. You hear that, certain games? If I wanted to check out a slow burn, I'd go to Book Talk and read that one slow burn book where the couple don't even end up together in the end. All it did was slow with no burn. Sorry, where was I? Alright, villains. Regardless of the arc, villains should be able to stand on their own and make an impact to the story too, even if not the main plot itself, but still influence perhaps the character's decisions or approaches in the future. But you can really tell Hokazono is pretty passionate about making the villains interesting and worth remembering, just as any other character should. Even if they're just gonna get bodied by Chihiro, at least they left a compelling impression by doing so. Again, everything is relevant. Even Kunishige, despite being dead, is extremely relevant. In fact, he's like the primordial factor in all this. Like, Chihiro may be the bus, but Kunishige be the bus driver. Everything seems to revolve or tie back to this man and his katanas. It's like if Kagurabachi was a sequel to another story where Kunishige was the protagonist and he just continues to haunt the narrative in the sequel. Yeah, that's pretty much how I describe it. But if you want a really accurate analogy on the plot of Kagurabachi, this Twitter user made a brilliant one right here. Imagine if Oppenheimer had a son and was like, I need to collect and disarm every single nuke in the world. But he kept getting jumped by dudes going, bro, I love your dad so much. No one made nukes like him, man. And you might think, ain't no way that's accurate. but I promise you, it is. And that brings me to my next and perhaps final and most important note. And that's the fact that I haven't even actually gone into depth onto what the story is actually about. Because despite what the first chapter in artwork would suggest, it's not what you might think it is. So what is Kagurabachi even about? Well, something most people, self-included, assume is that this is a vengeance story with an edgy, badass main character, and no one can really blame you if that's your very first impression of it. But you'd be surprised to know that that is not exactly the case. Without getting too descriptive with it, Chihiro's father died, or more accurately, was killed by a certain group, along with the theft of the 6 enchanted blades he forged. 6 very dangerous blades that were now in the hands of who knows who. And so Chihiro wants to retrieve these, essentially doing and honoring what his father would have wanted, taking back these blades from potentially being used for god-awful acts. It's a very pure and noble act, and here is where we come back to that quote I spoke of before that everyone goofs. I mentioned that it's not goofed for any negative reasons, but rather because it really makes it seem like Chihiro's will or motivation to go on his pursuit stems purely from vengeance. This hatred-driven idea is just a drop of water falling into a much greater sea. From the beginning, we see that Chihiro is someone who looks out for others and is very compassionate. Don't let his stale, hardly changing expression try to deceive you. His actions and words down the line are what truly reflect his character. Chihiro is a logical person. He will always try and aim for a logical approach, but he does have his moments of vulnerability, where he does feel overwhelmed, where he does doubt himself, where hatred does creep in and tries to get a hold of him. Yet, even so, he combats these negative emotions. He doesn't let them cloud his judgment and lead him down into making rash decisions. Instead, holding close his father's words, he tries to keep himself cool and level-headed in order to think critically and clearly. Emotions fuel us and grant us strength, but they can also misguide us. Logic helps us direct our emotions towards the things that are truly important and hone our strength and skills towards surpassing our current limitations and creating new ones. Chihiro does just this. He is driven by, in a nutshell, a desire to destroy the evil and save the weak. It's an altruistic, some would argue basic, perspective, but it's the will he inherited and carried along with his father. He saw how much care his father put into these swords, and how dedicated he was in this belief. And Chihiro, he cares, respects, and admires his father deeply, truly wanting to follow in his footsteps. And so he won't bend the knee and change his ideal ever. It was his father's, and in turn his belief, and he will carry it with honor on his behalf regardless. Chihiro's compassion is very prevalent throughout, even in the very first chapter. He is ruthless to those who are cruel, but when it comes to the victims, he is always ensuring their safety. So much so that he even put himself in some pretty extreme risk, yet while still taking in account that he does have his limits. He's not that stubborn, alright? One of my favorite presentations of Chihiro's kindness is very early on, when upon hearing a young girl showed up, asking for the help of a sorcerer. Shiba went first to question her, and discovered that she was orphaned. Chihiro didn't really question her in the moment, instead contemplated and, out of concern, asked her if she had eaten anything, to which in her own unique way she would say that she hasn't. When he took her to eat something, that's when he tried to question her and inquire further. But she tells him that she doesn't want to tell him. Chihiro doesn't continue pressuring her. Instead, he asks her something else that is more loosely related to the situation rather than personal. When she gets in a bit of a problem, he prioritized saving her, and upon doing so, would accept the task of helping her, simply because their roads coincided. But we have reason to believe that there was more to that than just because they shared common interest. Say, while he was fighting against one of the villains were yelling to the girl, trying to blame the girl for her mother's death because her mother died trying to protect her, and reminding her that she is all on her own. Chihiro, before making the decision, had contemplated these words, and don't forget you're all alone. It's very subtle, but it also tells me that Chihiro sympathized with the girl and her current situation. After all, he too lost a parental figure, and he too at some point felt alone post the incident. And this is something else that I like about the story. They're subtle with the way they present Chihiro's trauma and his way of thinking. They don't just flat out state it, but they do give you small hints like these where you could connect the dots and see further into it. So then later on, he will try to question her again. He doesn't ask these questions out of ill will. He just genuinely wants to know why they are after her and understand exactly what he is fighting for. But she wouldn't budge. She didn't want to respond. He wanted to instigate further, but he would once again remember the things the villain was saying to her. And while we don't get to see exactly what he was thinking, it seems like he put the pieces together himself on what she may be going through. And so he just lets it go, once again sympathizing with her and letting her tell him when she was ready to do so. And soon enough, she did try to open up before being interrupted. She had finally found a place to trust him, and he held those words close. He valued the trust she placed in him, not wanting to let her down and let those words be in vain. Chihiro is not a dense protagonist. He understands the value and weight of actions and words carry. He can pick up on social cues and read the room. Though there is one moment some could argue he's a bit dense, but to me it seems more so concern more than anything else, because I'd be concerned too if someone professed their love for my father. Holy, that sounds way worse than I would have imagined. And yeah, before you ask, that does happen in the story, in fact. As the meme goes, if I had a nickel for every time this happens, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice already. Along with it also comes people professing their affinity towards Chihiro as well. Okay, that sounds way better. But yeah, this feels more so like the face of someone who is concerned for your mental state rather than density, but I digress. I got a little sidetracked there. My bad. The truth of the matter is that in the end, the main character is the one we want to like, the one we want to root for. After all, it's the one we will be following throughout, and Chihiro is someone you will grow to love and enjoy, and who can stand on his own as his own individual character. But Chihiro doesn't go on this journey alone. It's not just Chihiro who makes the story, but those who tag along with him too. There's Shiba, who supports him all along the way, and others who I can't go into because of spoilers, but Everything I've talked about up till now put together is what makes this story so great. How Chihiro's character clashes with or bounces off other characters. All of it is what makes a story that I believe is worth giving a chance. I could go on breaking down every detail of the story, but that's not the point of today's video. This is a video to hopefully introduce more people to this manga. I would gladly make a video breaking down, analyzing everything for those who may be interested, but I promise you, you will not regret reading it. It is a fun and great experience. And I'm sure, as all things, it might not be perfect, but I don't go reading looking for flaws or perfection. Rather, just to have a good time and be in it for the journey of the story it's trying to tell and connect with it. Isn't that what consuming media should be? And with that, we conclude this session. My thoughts were kinda all over the place in the making of this, so hopefully it was comprehensive in the end and that you enjoyed it. There are so many things I wished I could go deeper on because I can go deeper. But I think I'll just leave that for another video if that interests you. But I digress. Feel free to share your thoughts on it. What do you think of Kagurabachi? Have you read it before? What made you read it and what made you enjoy it? I'd love to hear it. I always respond to comments. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and may we meet again in some other part of the universe.